I would like now to switch a little bit to the Solomon Islands because I would like to know your take. End of May, uh, Minister Wang Yi went to talk to the 10 island nations, and he was planning to sign a sweeping trade and security agreement. And the headlines then said, yeah, he was rejected, he lost, it's a failure. But I'm not so sure. I think he rather lost a battle than a war. I think the Chinese will be back, and I don't see them giving up. So does the mainstream media get it wrong?
Yes, they
Yes.
did. You're right. You look. I don't think the minister even intended to have everybody sign it. I think he was more applying pressure, but he was also seeing in each of these islands where the opposition was, and that's useful if you want to target these people later. But also, you notice on his visit that he did sign agreements with several countries.
Yes, he
Uh,
did.
the Kiribati, uh, Tonga, and Samoa, for example. And these agreements really advance Chinese interests pretty nicely, calling for cooperation, say, on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief planning, and preparation, which potentially allows the Chinese military in. He's solidified
Yes.
the agreement with the Solomon Islands that has now seen Chinese police down there doing training, probably going to establish a permanent presence. So he solidified these relationships, and in football terms, he moved the ball forward. Maybe he didn't go all the way, score a touchdown or a try, but or a goal, but he did move it forward pretty well. And as you say, they will be back. They have been actively engaging in political warfare in the Pacific for at least 30 years that I know of. It's actually 50 is closer, but 30 I'm personally familiar with. And this is in every part of the Pacific Islands. And some of these places seem very small, uh, maybe unimportant, but if you look at them on a map, if you think of them strategically, they are essential. And Solomon Islands, for example, with the Chinese presence there, it potentially cuts off Australia from trade and communications links with the American West Coast. Potentially blocks Australia from getting up to the north. Kiribati that I mentioned, the Chinese are going to rebuild or restore a World War II era American airstrip, supposedly to bring in tourists. There's about 20 people on the island, but Kiribati is about 1,000 miles from Hawaii. And there's a couple other islands in the chain, and Chinese military operating from there would require the Americans to pay a lot of attention to Chinese nearby. It's sort of it's equivalent to what the Japanese did in World War II. They expanded out into the Pacific, and the reason was to go after the Americans, to keep the Americans at bay. And the Chinese are sort of doing this in the same thing the Japanese did, and that they said they're going to do it. And the Chinese, it's important to remember, are as smart as we are. You see, in the U.S. military, for many years there was a condescension. They
Yes.
will never be like us. We're so
Yeah, they
wonderful.
just produce the cheap stuff. They won't be
Yeah.
able to do, yeah, whatever.
Unfortunately, that's wrong. And when you're Marines in particular, we're narcissists anyway, so nobody could be as good as us. But I was trying to, even I knew they say they are as smart as us. And the Chinese built the left half of the American transcontinental railway back in the 19th century. And that was the hard half through the mountains, and they did it with pickaxes, shovels, and a little dynamite. And nobody should underestimate them. But they have looked at the map of the Pacific and of Latin America and of Africa, and you look where their commercial operations are, and you can see how eventually, if there's a military component, if the military gets in, that they have the potential to lock up the Pacific, lock up the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. It may not be tomorrow, it won't be, but over time, that's the objective, one might say.
And it also thinks, I think it also serves another purpose, namely the CCP wants to show its neighbors that the US is far away. and we are here, we are closer, we are bigger. And now they show, look, Australia failed you, the US failed you, but we are here. So I think that's also the message that they are sending to the neighbors.
Very much, and the neighbors understand it.
Yes.
I just was mentioned this morning on another show that a couple of years ago, when the Chinese were harassing a Malaysian survey ship down in Malaysian waters at the bottom of the South China Sea, that the Americans sent a couple ships and the Australians sent another ship to sort of keep an eye on things and sort of comfort show the Malaysians we cared and we're going to
Yes.
protect them. And my friend, who's Southeast Asian and a defense analyst, he says, "Well, look, I've heard from my Malaysian friends that the Americans left and the Australians did too, and they were not happy about that because now they're by themselves to take on the Chinese." And that was the expression he used. The Chinese are always there, and everybody knows it. And so we have to be very careful about that when America thinks about what and its friends think about what they're going to do in the region. Does it look like we're just here for a little while and then going away? If it is, that's not very good, because the other side, the Chinese, see, well, they're going to be gone, and you don't want to get us mad for when we're the only ones around. And that's say there's there's a psychological aspect to much of what gets done in the defense world and the commercial world. And if it looks like the Chinese have the upper hand, more people are going to respond accordingly.
The other thing is that I think maybe there is a bigger picture we are missing, because you mentioned the blockade. So a lot of experts, they are talking that China might block Taiwan, but what if they are aiming for the whole area, for the region, or at least a part of it, and then negotiate with the West, say, hey, it's not only Taiwan, it's the whole area. So what do you do now? Impose sanctions? So within 5 or 10 years, they might be able to do that.
Unfortunately, yes, and think they could get away with it too. They could do it right now with the South China Sea if they wanted. For example, cut really tighten or choke the sea lanes going up to Japan and to Korea. They could do it if they wanted, but they probably couldn't handle the economic, the financial pressure that would be applied to them if they did it. But wait 5 years, and the dynamic changes. And at that point, so that's always important, is to look ahead, not just at today or tomorrow, but look 5 years out, 10 years out. And at that point, you could indeed have something of a blockade or a China deciding who's going to be able to go where. If we don't like the Japanese, they're not cooperating in giving us back these islands. So no Japanese ships are going to go through the Straits of Malacca, something like that. South Korea, same thing, which is about 100% dependent on sea lanes that are potentially cut by the Chinese. So that is something that indeed could happen. The Chinese have talked about doing these kind of things, so it's not a surprise that they understand how it would work and have an interest in doing it. It's always been the Americans who we always think of ourselves as the ones who can put the pressure on people, but it's not may not always be the case. We may actually someday have it applied to us. You see it already with threats to withhold, say, key materials. Say during the COVID
Yes.
situation, the Chinese were talking about, maybe letting the Americans drown in a sea of COVID by withholding pharmaceuticals, withholding the protective equipment. And that is something that definitely needs to be considered.
At the time when China is, producing more aircraft carriers and ships and jet fighters, the West is doing what? They are inviting 4 Asian countries to a NATO summit. So it's not really the same. They're publishing, they may be commenting, but Chinese are really producing hardware and they are expanding. So it's not really, we're not the same. I think they're really gaining slowly the upper hand.
Yeah, they're having a lot of hardware. A lot of
Yes.
ships, a lot of
Yes.
aircraft, it matters. And then combine your fishing fleet and your maritime militia.
Exactly.
And as you said, the Chinese, lately, the last few years, they've been turning out about 7 warships for every one the Americans produce. And that gives you some idea of how the balance is shifting. If we're not careful, and I mean, we have to get on this immediately. The U.S. Navy is about 298 ships, going down to 280. The Chinese are about 350, and they're going up in the other
The
direction.
opposite direction, yes.
Yeah, and so it is a huge problem. When an American ship goes into the South China Sea, it gets a lot of attention because it's doing exercises and flexing its muscles. But if the Chinese wanted, they could put 10 ships to follow it, to, escort it. And numbers do matter. And it does allow China to expand its influence, expand its power beyond the so-called First Island chain. For now, and probably for about the next 5 years, Chinese ability to exert power beyond the First Island chain, or particularly to fight, it drops off very quickly. But just wait a little while, wait 5-10 years, and things will probably be different, would be my sense, if we don't take necessary steps right now.